As the year 1945 thundered into existence, a sense of inevitability swept across Europe like a gathering storm. The once mighty Nazi war machine was splintering, bleeding from 1,000 wounds. Hitler's empire, built on fear, iron, and fire, was collapsing under the weight of its own ambition. The Allies, like wolves that had tracked their prey for years, now closed in from all sides. In the East, the Red Army was a tidal wave of vengeance. After years of brutal suffering, Soviet forces had transformed into a ruthless, unstoppable juggernaut. City by city, village by village, they carved through Eastern Europe, leaving behind a trail of shattered German defenses and smoldering ruins. Each Soviet division moved like a hammer, pounding the Wehrmacht into the earth. To the west, American, British, and Canadian forces surged across the Rhine River in a thunderclap of artillery and armor. German towns fell like dominoes, their streets echoing with the roar of Sherman tanks and the rattle of machine guns. Allied bombers blackened the sky, raining fire on Nazi infrastructure, choking the heart of Hitler's industrial lifeline. In Berlin, the smell of death clung to the air. Once a city of pride and power, it was now a crumbling fortress of hopelessness. Hitler, increasingly paranoid and delusional, barked impossible orders from his underground bunker. Maps no longer showed victory's Martyrdom. His generals knew the war was lost, yet none dared to speak the truth aloud. Loyalty had turned to fear. Confidence had rotted into despair. Across Germany, chaos reigned. Cities lay in ruin. Refugees clogged the roads. The air carried the sound of distant explosions approaching like a storm front. Civilians whispered of the end, of retribution, of fire and blood. The Reich was not falling, it was disintegrating. Meanwhile, the Pacific theater burned with a different kind of fury. The war against Japan had entered its deadliest phase. On islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, American soldiers faced an enemy that preferred death to surrender. Kamikaze pilots screamed from the skies, slamming into naval vessels with suicidal precision. The ocean ran red. The jungles became each island captured was a mountain of corpses. Each victory was soaked in the blood of thousands. The cost was immense, yet the Allies pressed on. Japan's homeland now loomed on the horizon, and the shadow of an unthinkable weapon, the atomic bomb, was beginning to take shape behind closed doors in the American desert. The world was holding its breath. In Italy, Mussolini's dream had already turned to ash. Fascist symbols were torn down, and his regime crumbled under the pressure of both Allied assault and Italian resistance. The once proud Ducey now clung to survival, a hunted man in his own land. His downfall was a grim omen of what was to come for Hitler. In France, the ghost of D-Day still lingered in the shattered Normandy coastline. The liberation of Paris was a memory carved in stone, a moment of hope in a war of nightmares. But no one could forget the price. Graves stretched endlessly across the fields of Europe. The final act of World War II was unfolding. Every bullet fired, every inch gained, now echoed with the ghosts of millions lost. No one would escape unchanged. Nations trembled. Leaders plotted. Soldiers braced for impact. And in the heart of Berlin, beneath layers of concrete and lies, Adolf Hitler clung to the belief that the Reich could still rise. He was wrong. The reckoning had begun. The world was ablaze. By 1943, World War II had reached its boiling point. The thunder of artillery shook the earth on every front, east, west, Pacific, and North Africa. There were no safe havens. No moments of silence, just an endless storm of bullets, bombs, and in the East, the Soviet Red Army had tasted victory at Stalingrad. But they weren't done. Stalin demanded blood, German blood. Operation Citadel was Hitler's last gamble to regain control of the Eastern Front. Thousands of panzers rolled into one of the largest tank battles in human history. Steel clashed with steel. Flames devoured tanks. Entire fields turned into graveyards of twisted iron. But the Soviets stood like granite, unmoving, and unleashed their... The German spear was broken. The dream of conquest in the East died with it. Back in Western Europe, resistance grew stronger. Underground networks in France, Belgium, and Norway struck German targets under the cover of night, sabotage, ambush, assassinations. Every whisper in the dark became a dagger in the Reich's back. Hitler responded with brutality, mass executions. Entire villages burned. But for every rebel he killed, two more rose in defiance. Europe was bleeding, but not broken. Across the Mediterranean, The Allies launched Operation Husky. Sicily became a battlefield. American and British forces stormed the beaches with naval guns thundering behind them. Paratroopers rained from the skies, engaging in fierce stretch-to-street combat against Dugan Axis defenders. Mussolini's Italy crumbled. He was arrested, humiliated, and stripped of power. The Italian people turned their backs on fascism. Hitler scrambled to rescue him, sending elite SS units to pull him from captivity in a daring glider raid. But the damage was done. The southern door to Europe had been kicked open. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the tide of war shifted dramatically. American forces battered at Pearl Harbor were now on the offensive. The Battle of Midway had crippled the Japanese carrier fleet. Island by island, jungle by jungle, U.S. Marines fought a brutal campaign of attrition. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan. Each victory was paid for in oceans of blood. Kamikaze pilots screamed from the skies in suicidal fury. American flamethrowers answered from the ground. It wasn't war, it was slaughter on both sides. Back in Germany, something darker stirred. Hitler ordered the acceleration of the final solution. Trains full of innocent soulsmen, women, children were herded like cattle to death camps. Auschwitz, Treblinka, gas chambers hissed. Crematoriums smoked. The greatest horror of the war wasn't on the battlefield, it was behind barbed wire. The world remained mostly silent. Some whispered, some suspected, but most didn't believe evil could be that absolute. They were wrong. At sea, German U-boats hunted Allied supply ships like wolves. Convoys across the Atlantic faced constant terror. Sailors froze in lifeboats, watching their ships burn and sink beneath black waves. But the Allies fought back with sonar depth charges and naval escort fleets. Slowly, the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic turned. What was once a feeding ground for the Kriegsmarine became a graveyard of steel coffins. And then came 1944. The Allies prepared to strike at the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe. Thousands of ships, tanks, and men gathered in Britain for one of the most daring military operations in history. Operation Overlord today was still to come. The winds of vengeance roared over the English Channel in June 1944. Allied forces, forged in fire and blood, launched the most ambitious military invasion in history. The beaches of Normandy were more than sand and sea. They were the front line of liberation, soaked in the courage of men who knew they might not see another sunrise. As dawn broke on June 6, 1944, deed over. 150,000 Allied troops stormed the beaches under a relentless hail of German gunfire. The air crackled with gunshots, the sea churned red with blood, and the sky rumbled with the thunder of aircraft. Omaha Beach became a slaughterhouse, men cut down before they could even reach cover. Bodies piled on barbed wire, smoke blanketing their final cries. Yet, inch by inch, they pressed forward. The Germans, caught between Hitler's delayed reinforcements and the ferocity of the Allied assaults, began to falter. The Atlantic Wall, once touted as impregnable, was breached. Town by town, the Allies moved through France. Resistance fighters, once hiding in shadows, rose in flames of rebellion. Cities like Cannes, Saint-Lay, and Cherbourg paid dearly in destruction, but each one was a nail in the coffin of Nazi occupation. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the Soviets were preparing their own reckoning. Operation Bagration, launched in June 1944, was a titanic offensive that shattered German Army Group Center. Over 500,000 German soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. The Red Army thundered through Eastern Europe like an unstoppable avalanche, sweeping through Belarus, Poland, and the Baltics with merciless precision. As the noose tightened, Hitler retreated further into delusion. Berlin echoed with his fury and paranoia. He ordered phantom armies that no longer existed. His generals, aware of the looming defeat, dared not speak truth. Meanwhile, civilians starved in bombed-out cities, their homes reduced to rubble, their hopes buried under ash. By December 1944, the Nazis launched one final, desperate counterattack, the Battle of the Bulge, deep in the Ardennes forest. Germany tried to split the Allied forces in a surprise winter assault. American troops, outnumbered and freezing, fought back with unmatched valor. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne held their ground against overwhelming odds, refusing surrender with one word: nuts. The German offensive failed, leaving behind a trail of broken tanks, shattered morale, and tens of thousands dead. From that moment on, the Third Reich was in retreat on all fronts. Hitler's empire, once vast and terrifying, was now a smoldering ruin crumbling beneath the feet of its enemies. Allied bombers darkened the skies over Germany. City after city, Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne walls turned into the world watched, breathless, as the final act of the war approached. Soviet troops pushed into Prussia and Poland, their boots grinding over frozen earth and shattered lives. American forces surged through the Rhineland, liberating concentration camps and confronting the true horror of Nazi ideology. In the spring of 1945, the Allies stood at Germany's doorstep. Berlin was surrounded. The end was near, but the bloodshed was not over. Hitler, trapped in his underground bunker, clung to fantasies of salvation, but there would be no miracle. The Reich that promised 1,000 years was now down to its final weeks. The world, battered but not broken, prepared to witness the fall of a monster. The world rebuilt on ashes. The war ended, but peace did not begin. The cities were nothing but skeletons of civilization. Berlin, Warsaw, Tokyo, Dresden, charred bones of what once were proud capitals. The sky no longer rained bombs, but the silence was louder than the sirens. In the silence, grief spoke. In the ruins, the world questioned its humanity. Germany was carved up like Prodovidid between the Allies and the Soviets. East and West Berlin became the first battlefield of a new Cold War, a war fought with spies, propaganda, and nuclear shadows. The Nazi regime had fallen, but the ghosts of fascism haunted Europe's ashes. Japan, devastated by two blinding flashes in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, bowed in defeat. But the price was unfathomable. Hundreds of thousands vaporized, generations cursed with radiation scars. Yet, from the rubble, Japan would rise not as an empire, but as a nation reborn in discipline and defiance. Millions of soldiers returned home, broken in body, tormented in mind. Some brought medals, others brought memories that would never let them sleep again. Widows wept, mothers mourned, and orphans stared into a future without fathers. And yet, something strange happened. The world, began to rebuild. In 1945, the victors did something history had rarely seen. They put the vanquished on trial. The Nuremberg trials were more than legal proceeding. They were a reckoning. The world heard, for the first time, the full horror of the Holocaust. Photographs, testimonies, and footage revealed the gas chambers, the death trains, the human experiments. Men like Göring and Hess were forced to face what they had unleashed. One by one, the architects of genocide were sentenced not just for war, but for crimes against humanity. The verdict echoed across history. Never again. But justice was not blind. Not all criminals were punished. Some slipped into the shadows, others were quietly recruited by victorious powers for their scientific knowledge and intelligence. The war had ended, but morality had entered a gray zone. Even as celebrations erupted in Times Square and Red Square, a new storm was brewing. The Soviet Union and the United States emerged as superpowers once allies, now adversaries locked in a deadly dance of ideology. Winston Churchill's words chilled the West. An iron curtain has descended across the continent. The world was split not just by borders, but by beliefs. Communism versus capitalism, red versus blue, east versus west. The nuclear bomb, once a symbol of victory, now became a symbol of annihilation. The arms race began. The Cold War began. Fear was now global policy. Legacy of fire and steel, World War II left more than destruction. It reshaped the very foundation of the planet. The United Nations was born not as a dream, but as a desperate attempt to never repeat the nightmare. Israel was created, igniting new conflicts that would burn for decades. Colonial empires collapsed, giving rise to independence movements from Africa to Asia. Women, who had filled factories and fought battles, refused to return silently to their kitchens. Technology surged. Jet engines, rockets, computers, all born in the crucible of war, now began to shape the new world. The very horrors of battle had sparked innovation that would one day reach the stars. But the most powerful legacy was remembrance. From the beaches of Normandy to the jungle of Guadalcanal, from the snows of Stalingrad to the ashes of Dresden, every battlefield was a warning. This was not just history. World War II was not just the largest conflict in human history, it was the defining event of the 20th century. Over 70 million lives lost, entire nations scarred forever, new powers born, old empires buried. It was a war of tanks and trenches, of code breakers and kamikazes, of genocides and heroism, a war where the line between good and evil was sometimes